When my parents told me they had spent my college fund, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stared at my mother and asked one question. How much? She wouldn't look at me. My father sighed. All of it. Every dollar. The money they'd promised me since I was 12. The money I'd watched grow year after year. The money I had planned to use to become the first person in our family to graduate from college. Gone. And the reason they gave me? My brother's wedding. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my childhood, I believed my parents loved both of their children equally. I was wrong. My older brother Jason had always been the favorite. Everyone knew it, but nobody talked about it. Jason could make a mistake, and Dad would call it part of growing up. I could make one small mistake, and Mom would ask why I couldn't be more responsible. Jason wanted a new car, they found a way to buy one. I wanted a used laptop for school, I was told to save my allowance. Jason played football, Dad never missed a game. I won a regional academic competition, Mom congratulated me while preparing dinner. But I never complained, because I thought there was one thing that was finally mine: my education. When I was 12, my grandmother gave my parents money for my future. Dad opened a savings account in my name. He told me, "Emily, this is for college. Nobody touches it." I believed him. Every birthday, relatives added money. Every Christmas, I put part of my gift money into it. By 18, there was enough to cover most of my tuition. I had already been accepted into a university 3 hours from home. I had chosen my classes. I had even bought a cheap blue suitcase. I thought my future had finally begun. Then, Jason announced his engagement. He had been dating Megan for less than a year. The wedding was going to be enormous: a luxury hotel, 300 guests, a live band, designer suits, a professional photographer, a destination honeymoon. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while my mother showed me pictures of the venue. "It's beautiful," I said. She smiled. "Your brother deserves a beautiful wedding." I looked at the price. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. "How are you paying for all this?" My father didn't answer. I should have known then. A week later, I received an email from my university. My financial documents hadn't been completed. They needed proof that I could pay my remaining tuition. I called Dad. "Can you send the college the ACA statement?" There was silence. Then he said, "Emily, we need to talk." That night, I sat across from my parents in the living room. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom kept twisting her wedding ring. Finally, she said, "We had to use some of the money." "Some?" She looked at Dad. He finally spoke. "Most of it." My stomach dropped. "For my tuition?" "No." "For what?" My mother whispered. "Jason's wedding." I thought I'd misunderstood. "You're joking." Nobody laughed. I stood up. "You used my college money?" Dad immediately became defensive. "It wasn't like we stole it. It was saved for me. You're our parents." "Exactly." My voice cracked. "You promised me." Mom finally looked at me. "Emily, Jason's wedding was already planned. Deposits had been paid. We couldn't cancel everything." I stared at her. "So you canceled my future instead?" She shook her head. "You can go to community college." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe she was saying it. Jason gets a $40,000 wedding, and I get community college? Dad stood. "Don't make this about your brother. You're the ones who made it about him." Then my father said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. "Your brother is starting a family. You have your whole life ahead of you." I looked at him. "So because I'm younger, my future matters less?" He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. I went upstairs. I opened my closet, pulled out the blue suitcase, and started packing. My mother followed me. "Where are you going?" "Away." "Don't be dramatic." I stopped packing. "Mom, They took the only thing I had that was supposed to be mine. You don't get to call me dramatic for being hurt." She started crying, but I didn't. I left that night. I had $327 in my checking account, a suitcase, a laptop, and no idea what I was going to do next. I stayed with my old school friend, Rachel, for 3 weeks. Then I found a tiny apartment, then a second-hand car, then 2 jobs. I worked mornings at a bakery and nights answering customer service calls. I was exhausted constantly. There were nights when I came home and cried because I couldn't afford dinner, but I never called my parents. Not once. A month after I left, Jason's wedding happened. I saw pictures online. My brother stood beneath thousands of flowers. My mother wore a designer dress. My father gave a speech about how proud he was of his son. And underneath one photograph, my mother had written, "The happiest day of our lives." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I closed my laptop and went back to work. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the life I would build without them. Over the next few years, I worked harder than I had ever imagined possible. I eventually enrolled in night classes. I studied accounting and business. I graduated later than I originally planned, but I graduated. Then I got a job at a small investment company. I learned everything I could. I started investing. I started saving. Slowly, my life changed. The girl who had once counted every dollar in her bank account became a woman who understood money better than anyone in her family. 5 years passed. I barely spoke to my parents. Occasionally, Mom sent a birthday message. I answered politely, but there was no relationship anymore. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my father's name. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hello?" He sounded different, older, tired. "Emily?" "Yes?" "We need your help." I leaned back in my chair. "What happened?" There was a long pause. Then he said, "It's about the house. My childhood home, the place where my parents had raised us, the place they'd celebrated Jason's engagement, the place I'd left with one suitcase. What about it?" "We're in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "We're selling the property." "Okay." "We can't." "Why not?" Another pause. "Because we need your signature." My heart started beating faster. Why would you need my signature? My father didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "There's something we never told you about the money your grandmother left." I froze. "What?" "The college fund. It wasn't just a college fund." I sat completely still. "What are you talking about?" Dad lowered his voice. "Emily, if you don't sign these papers, we could lose everything." I looked down at my desk. 5 years ago, they had taken my future to pay for my brother's wedding. Now, they were asking me to use the future I'd built without them to save theirs. And for the first time, I wondered exactly what my grandmother had left me, because suddenly, I realized my parents hadn't just stolen my college money. They had been hiding something from me. And whatever it was worth enough to make my entire family terrified. I stared at my father through the phone. "What did Grandma leave me?" He took a breath. "Not something. A legal interest." I didn't understand. "What does that mean?" "It means your grandmother didn't simply give us money for your college. She created a trust." I stood from my desk. "And you used it?" "We thought we could." "You thought?" My voice became colder. "You took money that was legally protected for my education and spent it on Jason's wedding?" "We didn't know all the details." "Did you know the money was mine?" "Yes." That answer hurt more than anything else. I closed my eyes. "Send me the paperwork." "We need you to come home." "No." "Emily, please. I'll review the documents with my attorney." My father went silent. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Your brother's involved, too." I frowned. "What does Jason have to do with this?" "He signed something." What did he sign? I can't explain it over the phone. You can try. Another pause. Then Dad whispered, Your grandmother put the house into the trust as collateral. I froze. The house, my childhood home, the same house my parents had been trying to sell. They couldn't sell it without my signature. But why? I hung up. The next morning, I contacted an attorney named Sarah Bennett. I gave her every document my father had sent. She spent almost 2 hours reviewing them. Finally, she looked up. Emily, this is much bigger than your college fund. How much bigger? She turned the document toward me. Your grandmother created a family education trust. The original principal was $85,000. I stared at the number. 85,000? Yes. That's not what was in my account. Sarah shook her head. No, because your parents withdrew money from it repeatedly. For Jason's wedding? Not just the wedding. My stomach tightened. She continued. They used some of it for the wedding, some for your brother's car, some for business debts, and eventually they transferred the remaining amount into another account. I felt sick. So they didn't just spend my college money, they drained the trust. Sarah nodded. And that's where the second problem begins. She pointed to another section. Your grandmother anticipated that something like this might happen. What did she do? If the trust was used for anything other than your education, the beneficiary could demand repayment. I stared at her. Me? Yes. From my parents? Yes. I laughed bitterly. So they called me because they need me to sign away the money they stole from me? Essentially. Sarah wasn't finished. And there's something else. She pulled out another document. Your grandmother placed a restriction on the family home. If the trust was misused, the property could not be sold without the beneficiary's consent. My parents hadn't been trying to sell the house because they wanted to move. They were trying to sell it because they needed money, and my signature was the only thing standing in their way. I asked Sarah the question I'd been afraid to ask. How much is the house worth? Approximately $1.8 million. I stared at her. My parents had spent my college fund, and now they wanted my permission to sell a house worth nearly $2 million? What happens if I refuse? Sarah looked at me. They can't sell it, and they would have to repay the trust. How much? With interest? She calculated quickly. Approximately $140,000. I leaned back. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, power. My parents had spent my future because they believed I was the child who could be sacrificed. Now they were the ones who needed me. That evening, I drove back to my hometown. I hadn't been inside that house in 5 years. Everything looked smaller. The front porch, the garden, even the hallway where I'd once packed my suitcase. My mother opened the door. The moment she saw me, she started crying. Emily! I didn't hug her. Where's Dad? In the kitchen. I walked inside. Jason was there too. He stood up. Hey, Em. I looked at him. He was wearing an expensive watch, the same kind of watch he'd received as a wedding gift, the wedding my college fund had helped pay for. How's married life? I asked. His smile disappeared. Complicated. I nodded. Looks like everything is. We sat at the dining table. Dad placed a stack of papers in front of me. We just need you to sign. I didn't touch them. Explain everything first. Mom started crying again. We're going to lose the house. I looked at her. You didn't think about losing my education when you spent the money. She lowered her head. We made a mistake. No, you made a choice. Dad sighed. We thought Jason needed help. He was getting married. He was 27. He could have paid for his own wedding. Jason suddenly spoke. Emily, I didn't know. You didn't know what? That you were using your college money. I stared at him. You didn't know? No, I swear. I wanted to believe him, but then I noticed something. His hands were shaking. Jason, what? How much debt do you have? He looked at Mom, then Dad. Finally, he admitted it. About $600,000. I stared at him. From what? The business. What business? He looked away. I started a construction company 3 years ago. Things went badly. I understood. The wedding wasn't the only thing they'd funded. My parents had been using their assets and apparently my college trust to keep Jason's life from collapsing. Dad pushed another document toward me. That's why we need to sell the house. I picked it up, then stopped. There was something strange. The buyer's name was listed at the bottom, Carter Development Group. I recognized the name. I had recently reviewed an investment proposal from that company at work. It was a major real estate firm, and the offer for my parents' house was far below market value. I looked at Dad. "You're selling the house for $900,000? He nodded. "The market has changed." I laughed. "No, the market hasn't changed. You're desperate." Nobody spoke. I looked at Jason. "Who introduced you to this buyer?" He didn't answer. I knew. "You did." He looked down. "Jason, what? Why would you sell a $1.8 million property for $900,000? He finally broke. "Because they said it's the only offer we'd get." I looked at the documents again. Something wasn't right. I called Sarah. She reviewed the paperwork while I waited. Then she said 4 words that changed everything. "Don't sign anything." Why? "Because this buyer isn't offering you half the property's value by accident." What do you mean? "The company buying your parents' house is owned by the same investment group that owns Jason's business debt." I stared at the papers. Suddenly, everything made sense. Someone wasn't simply buying the house. Someone was trying to use my family's desperation to acquire it cheaply. And my parents were so desperate to save Jason, they hadn't even noticed. I looked at my father. "Did you read these documents?" "Of course." "No, Dad, you didn't. You signed them. You didn't read them." He looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I turned the contract around. "There's a clause here. If the sale goes through, the buyer assumes certain liabilities." Dad nodded. "Yes." I pointed to the next paragraph. "But Jason's business debt stays with you." He froze. "What?" "His debt stays with you, and the house gets sold. You lose the property, and Jason still owes the money." My mother covered her mouth. Jason stood. "That's impossible." I handed him the document. "Read it." He did. His face changed. The room went silent. They had nearly sacrificed the family home and still wouldn't have solved Jason's problem. My father looked at me. "Emily, I know you hate what we did, but you're the only person who can stop this." I looked at the signature line. 5 years ago, they signed away my future. Now, they wanted me to sign away theirs. I picked up the pen. My mother held her breath. Jason stared at me. Dad whispered, "Please." I placed the pen on the table, but I didn't sign. Instead, I looked at all 3 of them. "I'll help you." Their faces filled with relief. Then I finished my sentence. "But I'm not gonna help you the way you think." I slid the contract back across the table. "I won't sign this." Dad's face fell. "But I'm going to stop the sale." Jason stared at me. "Then what are we supposed to do?" I looked at him. "For the first time in your life, you're going to face the consequences of your own choices." My mother started crying, but I wasn't finished. I placed another document on the table, a repayment agreement prepared by Sarah. "You owe the trust $140,000. Dad looked shocked. "Emily, I'm not asking for the money today, but you're going to repay every dollar. And Jason," I looked at my brother, "you're going to deal with your own debt." He stared at me. "You can't do this." I smiled sadly. "Actually, I can, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the child asking my parents for permission. I was the person holding the pen, and they were the ones waiting for my decision. But there was still one thing I hadn't told them. I'd already contacted the bank, and I discovered exactly where the missing money had gone. And the name on the final account wasn't my father's. It was Jason's.